Mark Johnson thought a weekend alone at his family's cabin in the California mountains would be exactly what he needed. Work stress had been eating at him for months, and his doctor suggested he take some time away from the city. The cabin near Lake Tahoe had been in his family for generations, a perfect retreat nestled among towering pine trees and complete isolation. Mark arrived on Friday evening just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The cabin was exactly as he remembered from childhood visits, rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the forest. He unpacked his groceries and settled in for what he hoped would be a peaceful weekend. The first night passed without incident. Mark slept better than he had in months, lulled by the sounds of wind through the trees and the distant call of owls. But Saturday night was different. Mark was reading by the fireplace when he first heard it. A soft tapping on the window behind him. He turned around but saw only darkness beyond the glass. The tapping stopped. He returned to his book, thinking it was probably just a branch blown by the wind. 10 minutes later, the tapping resumed. This time it was more deliberate. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Mark got up and turned on the outside light. The porch was empty except for 2 old rocking chairs his grandmother had left there decades ago. No branches were close enough to touch the window. Mark checked all the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. The cabin had been broken into by raccoons before. He didn't want any unwanted animal visitors. Everything was secure. He went back to reading, but the tapping continued. It seemed to be moving around the cabin from window to window. First the living room, then the kitchen, then his bedroom upstairs. Always the same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. By midnight, Mark was getting annoyed. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. The mountain air was crisp and still. He walked around the entire cabin, shining his light into the trees and bushes. Nothing. But as he came back around to the front porch, he noticed something odd. The rocking chairs were moving. Just slightly, as if someone had been sitting in them moments before, but there was no wind. The night was completely still. Mark stood on the porch and called out, "Hello? Is someone out there? This is private property." His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. He waited a few minutes, then went back inside. The tapping resumed immediately, now coming from all sides of the cabin simultaneously. It was as if multiple people were surrounding the building, all tapping in perfect synchronization. Mark tried to ignore it, but the sound was maddening. He called his brother Tom, who lived in Sacramento. "Tom, I'm at the cabin and something weird is happening. Someone's outside tapping on the windows." "Probably just kids from the other cabins," Tom said. "You know how sound carries up there. Could be coming from anywhere." But Mark knew better. The nearest cabin was over 2 miles away, and the tapping was definitely coming from right outside his windows. He described the pattern to Tom, who suggested it might be an animal looking for food. "Animals don't tap in patterns, Tom. This is deliberate. Someone's out there." Tom offered to drive up, but it was a 3-hour trip, and Mark didn't want to overreact. They agreed that Mark would call back if things got worse. Things got worse. Around 1 a.m., the tapping stopped completely. Mark felt relieved and started getting ready for bed. But as he brushed his teeth in the upstairs bathroom, he heard a new sound. Footsteps on the roof. Someone was walking around on the roof directly above his head. Heavy footsteps moving slowly from one end of the cabin to the other. Mark grabbed his flashlight and went outside again, but from the ground, he couldn't see anyone on the roof. The footsteps continued for 20 minutes, then stopped. Mark waited outside for another 10 minutes, but heard nothing more. He went back inside and tried to sleep, but every creak of the old cabin made him jump. At 3 a.m., Mark was awakened by a sound that made his blood freeze. Someone was trying to open the front door, not knocking, not banging, just quietly turning the handle and pushing against the door. The deadbolt held, but the door shook slightly with each attempt. Mark crept downstairs and peered through the front window. He could see a dark figure standing at the door, but the porch light cast strange shadows, making it impossible to make out any details. The figure seemed tall and thin, wearing what looked like dark clothing. The figure tried the door for several minutes, then moved to the kitchen window. Mark followed the sound, staying low and out of sight. Through the kitchen window, he could see the figure more clearly now. It appeared to be a man, but something was wrong with the way he moved. Too stiff, too unnatural. The man pressed his face against the kitchen window, and Mark gasped. In the dim light, he could see that the man's skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes reflected the interior lights like an animal's. The man seemed to be staring directly at Mark, even though Mark was hidden behind the counter. Mark fumbled for his phone and called 911. The nearest sheriff's station was in the valley, at least 45 minutes away. The dispatcher said they would send someone as soon as possible, but Mark would have to wait. The man outside moved away from the kitchen window and began circling the cabin again. Mark could track his movement by the sound of footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. The man was taking his time, checking every window, every door, looking for a way in. Mark remembered that his grandfather had kept a hunting rifle in the coat closet. He found it and checked to make sure it was loaded. His hands were shaking, but the weight of the rifle gave him some comfort. The man outside had returned to the front door and was now doing something different. Instead of trying the handle, he was scratching at the wood around the lock. Mark could hear the sound clearly. A rhythmic scraping, as if the man was using his fingernails or maybe a knife. Mark positioned himself at the top of the stairs where he could see the front door but remain hidden. The scratching continued for what felt like hours. Mark checked his phone repeatedly, hoping to see headlights from a police car, but the forest remained dark. At 4:30 a.m., the scratching stopped. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Mark strained to listen but heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Then came a sound that nearly made Mark scream. Someone was knocking on the back door. Not the deliberate tapping from before, but urgent, frantic knocking. As if someone was in trouble and needed help. Mark crept through the cabin to the back door, rifle in hand. The knocking continued, becoming more desperate. A voice called out, muffled by the door, "Help me. Please, someone's chasing me. Let me in." It sounded like a woman's voice, young and terrified. Mark's instincts told him to help, but something felt wrong. He had been watching the front of the cabin for hours, and no one had come or gone. How had someone gotten to the back door without him hearing them? "Who are you?" Mark called through the door. "What's wrong?" "My name is Jennifer. I was hiking and got lost. There's someone in the woods. He's been following me for hours. Please, I just need to use your phone." Mark hesitated. The voice sounded genuine, but the timing was too coincidental. "Where are you from? How did you find this cabin?" "I saw your lights. Please, he's coming. I can hear him in the trees." Mark looked through the back window but couldn't see anyone. The voice was definitely coming from right outside the door, but no one was visible. "I'm going to call the police for you," Mark said. "They're already on their way. You'll be safe in a few minutes." The knocking stopped immediately. No response. Mark waited, listening carefully. After several minutes of silence, he heard footsteps moving away from the back door, but they seemed to be going up instead of down. Someone was climbing onto the roof again. The footsteps moved across the roof slowly, then stopped directly above Mark's head. Something was lowered past the living room window. It looked like a rope or maybe hair. Long, dark strands swaying in the breeze. Mark backed away from the window and raised the rifle. Whatever was on his roof wasn't human. No person can move the way this thing moved, or hang things from the roof like that. The sheriff's deputy arrived at sunrise, just as the first light was filtering through the trees. Mark had spent the entire night huddled in the upstairs bedroom, rifle across his knees, listening to the sounds of something moving around the cabin. Deputy Martinez was a local who knew the area well. He searched the grounds thoroughly, but found no evidence of an intruder. No footprints, no scratches on the doors, nothing. "You sure you want dreaming?" Deputy Martinez asked. "Sometimes city folks come up here and the isolation gets to them. Your mind can play tricks on you." But Mark knew what he had experienced. He packed his things and left that morning, never to return. Before he drove away, he asked Deputy Martinez about the history of the area. "Oh, there are lots of stories about these woods," the deputy said. "Native Americans used to say this whole area was cursed. Something about angry spirits trapped in the trees. But that's just folklore." Mark drove back to Los Angeles and never spoke about what happened at the cabin. He sold his share of the property to his brother Tom, who thought he was crazy for giving up such a beautiful retreat. But Tom's opinion changed 6 months later when he decided to spend the weekend at the cabin. The tapping started on his first night there. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, moving from window to window, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Time lasted 2 hours before he packed his car and drove back to Sacramento. The next week, he put the cabin up for sale. It's been on the market for 3 years now, and the price keeps dropping. But somehow, no one who visits the property ever makes an offer. The real estate agent says it's because the cabin needs too much work. But the locals know better. They know that some places are meant to stay empty. Some things are better left alone. Becca Martinez had just moved into her dream house in a quiet suburb outside of Phoenix, Arizona. After months of apartment living, she was thrilled to finally have her own space, complete with a backyard and garage. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Well-maintained houses, friendly neighbors, and a genuine sense of community. Rebecca worked from home as a freelance web designer, so she spent most of her time in the house. During her first week, she met several neighbors who welcomed her warmly. There was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived alone next door and baked incredible cookies. Across the street lived the Johnsons, a young couple with 2 small children. Everyone seemed normal and pleasant. But there was one house that bothered Rebecca. The house directly behind hers, visible through her back kitchen window, appeared to be abandoned. The lawn was overgrown, newspapers were piled on the front porch, and the windows were dark day and night. Rebecca asked Mrs. Henderson about it during their second meeting. "Oh, that's the Peterson place," Mrs. Henderson said, her cheerful demeanor changing instantly. "It's been empty for about 6 months now. The family moved out suddenly, very suddenly." Mrs. Henderson seemed reluctant to say more, so Rebecca didn't press the issue. She figured every neighborhood had at least one abandoned house, and it wasn't really her business anyway. Rebecca settled into her routine quickly. She would work during the day, usually at her kitchen table where she could enjoy the natural light from the large window overlooking the backyard. In the evenings, she would cook dinner and relax in her living room. It was during her second week that she first noticed the light. Rebecca was washing dishes after dinner when she saw it, a single light in the back window of the Peterson house. Just for a moment, then it was gone. She thought maybe it was a reflection from her own kitchen, but when she turned off her lights, the other house remained dark. The next night, the light appeared again. Same window, same brief flash. This time, Rebecca was sure it wasn't a reflection. Someone was in that abandoned house. Rebecca mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson the following day. "Are you sure the Peterson house is empty? I've been seeing lights at night." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. "What kind of lights?" "Just a single light in the back window. Like someone with a flashlight or maybe a phone." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something about that house. The Peterson family didn't just move out, they fled. In the middle of the night, with only what they could carry." She explained that the Petersons had been complaining for months about someone watching their house. They would see faces in their windows at night, find footprints in their yard, and hear tapping on their doors. The police investigated several times but never found anyone. The final straw was when their daughter Emma found someone had been in her bedroom while the family was at church. Nothing was stolen, but someone had gone through her things, moved them around, left them in weird arrangements. Mrs. Henderson continued. They installed security cameras, but whoever was doing it was smart enough to avoid them. The family was terrified. They felt like they were being hunted. Did they ever figure out who it was? No. But the strange thing is, the same thing happened to the family who lived in your house before you bought it. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "The Williams family lived in your house for 3 years. They reported the same things. Someone watching their house, tapping on windows, evidence that someone had been inside when they weren't home. They moved out and sold the house at a loss just to get away." Mrs. Henderson looked directly at Rebecca. "I think someone lives in that abandoned house and targets the houses around it. Someone who knows the neighborhood routines and has figured out how to move around without being seen." That night, Rebecca couldn't concentrate on her work. She kept glancing at the Peterson house, looking for any sign of movement. At around 9 p.m., she saw the light again. This time, it stayed on longer, maybe 30 seconds. And it seemed to be moving, as if someone was walking around inside. Rebecca decided to call the police. She explained about the abandoned house and the lights she had been seeing. The officer who took her call was polite but didn't seem overly concerned. "We'll have a patrol car drive by tonight and check it out. If there's someone squatting in an abandoned house, we'll take care of it." Rebecca felt better knowing the police were aware of the situation. She went to bed early, hoping the problem would be resolved by morning. She was awakened at 2:30 a.m. by a sound that made her heart race. Someone was in her backyard. Rebecca's bedroom was on the second floor, and her window overlooked the backyard. She could hear footsteps on the patio below, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking around her house. She peered through her bedroom curtains and saw a dark figure near her back door. The figure appeared to be looking up at her house, studying the windows. Rebecca ducked back behind the curtains, her heart pounding. The footsteps moved around the house, and Rebecca followed the sound by moving from window to window. The figure was circling her house, just like the Peterson family had described. Rebecca grabbed her phone and called 911. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's outside my house. They're walking around in my backyard. Ma'am, what's your address? Rebecca gave her address and described what she was seeing. The dispatcher said police were on their way, but it would be about 10 minutes. The footsteps had stopped. Rebecca looked out her bedroom window again, but couldn't see anyone. She checked the other windows, but the figure had vanished. The backyard was empty and still. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found no one on the property. They searched the entire yard and the surrounding area, but whoever had been there was gone. The officers took Rebecca's statement and promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood. But Rebecca knew this was just the beginning. The next night, it happened again. Footsteps in the backyard at 2:30 a.m. This time, Rebecca was ready. She had positioned herself at the kitchen window where she had a better view of the yard. She saw the figure clearly. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing. He was standing near her back door, but instead of trying to break in, he seemed to be just watching the house, studying it, learning it. Rebecca called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. This pattern continued for a week. Every night at 2:30 a.m., the man would appear in her backyard. He never tried to break in, never caused any damage. He just watched. Rebecca installed motion sensor lights and the security camera system, but the man was smart. He seemed to know exactly where the cameras were positioned and how to avoid triggering the lights. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him on the edge of the camera's range, but never a clear image. The lack of sleep was starting to affect Rebecca's work and her mental health. She was jumping at every sound, checking the windows constantly, and had started sleeping with a baseball bat next to her bed. 2 weeks after the visits began, Rebecca discovered something that terrified her more than the nightly visits. She came home from grocery shopping and immediately noticed that something was different in her kitchen. The dishes in her sink had been rearranged. She always left them in the same pattern: plates on the left, glasses on the right, silverware in the middle. But now they were arranged differently, in the spiral pattern that seemed almost artistic. Rebecca checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. There was no sign of forced entry. But someone had definitely been in her house. She called the police, but without evidence of a break-in, there wasn't much they could do. They dusted for fingerprints, but found nothing except Rebecca's own prints. That night, Rebecca didn't go upstairs to bed. She sat in her living room chair with the baseball bat, facing the front door, waiting. She had decided she was going to catch this person in the act. At 2:30 a.m., she heard the familiar footsteps in the backyard. But this time, something was different. The footsteps didn't stay in the backyard. They moved around to the front of the house. Rebecca crept to the front window and peered through the curtains. The man was standing on her front lawn, looking directly at the window where she was hiding. In the dim street light, she could see his face for the first time. He was middle-aged, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. His hair was long and unkempt, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in months. But what terrified Rebecca most was his expression. He wasn't angry or threatening. He was smiling. The man raised his hand and waved at her. A slow, deliberate wave, as if he was greeting an old friend. Then he turned and walked back toward the Peterson house. Rebecca called 911 immediately, but she knew the police wouldn't find him. He was too smart, too careful. By the time they arrived, he would be back in his hiding place. The next morning, Rebecca packed a bag and drove to her sister's house in Tucson. She needed time to think and plan her next move. She couldn't live in fear anymore. While staying with her sister, Rebecca did research on the previous owners of her house. She found newspaper articles about the Williams family and their complaints about a stalker. She also found articles about the Peterson family and similar incidents. But the most disturbing thing she discovered was an article from 8 years ago about a man named Robert Hayes, who had been arrested for stalking and breaking into homes in the same neighborhood. Hayes had been released from prison 6 months ago, right around the time the Peterson family had fled their home. Rebecca took this information to the police, who were finally able to get a warrant to search the Peterson house. They found evidence that someone had been living there, camping equipment, stolen food, and most disturbing of all, photographs. Hayes had been taking pictures of the families in the neighborhood, photos of them sleeping, eating dinner, working in their yards. He had been studying their routines, learning their habits, preparing for something. They arrested Hayes at the Peterson house that evening. He didn't resist or try to run. He just smiled that same strange smile Rebecca had seen through her window. During questioning, Hayes admitted to stalking multiple families over the years. He said he enjoyed the fear he created, the feeling of control. He would study a family for months before moving on to the next target. Rebecca finally felt safe enough to return to her house, but she never felt completely comfortable there again. She installed better security systems and kept in close contact with the police. But every time she heard an unexpected noise or saw a shadow move across her yard, she remembered that smile and wondered if there might be others out there, watching and waiting. Hayes was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been working alone. There were too many incidents, too many families affected. Sometimes she wondered if there was an entire network of people like Hayes, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, terrorizing families for their own twisted pleasure. She never found out for sure. But sometimes, late at night, she still checks her windows and listens for footsteps in the backyard.